Expensive rugs lined the floor of the sand-laden, fully furnished tent. Desks made of fine wood, gleaming gold lamps, and silver water decanters lay about the space. A luxurious bed stood prominently, an iron chest at its foot. Contrary to the opulence of the tent, a large metal X sat upright in the middle of the room. It was made of thick iron beams, and it was firmly anchored to the floor. Each arm and leg of its iron beams had a hole in it, with a large metal chain running out of it. Positioned in the center of the X, a lever faced the entrance. The chains ran to the wrists and legs of a short, darkly tanned man with long, wavy black hair. He was heavily tattooed with black symbols in the shape of chains, and he wore nothing but a pair of loose-fitting white pants. Seated at the back wall of the tent, he wrote in a leather-bound book at one of the desks. He didn't look up when the group entered, and one of the guards, Caled, gave Leah a slight shove, prodding her to speak. She cleared her throat, then in a reverent tone said, "It is time." He looked at her, and sighed as he set the quill into his ink pot. Leah set the tray of food next to him, on a small, ornate end table without meeting his gaze. Then she walked to a corner of the tent and grabbed a large, plain clay pot. The pot, much like the metal X, looked out of place among the finery of the tent. She cradled the pot between her hands as she stood a pace away from him, her eyes firmly on the floor. "You should eat while you can, Godwolf," she said in a whisper. The heavily tattooed man grabbed a grape from the silver tray. He spun it as he looked it over. "Have you?" he replied quietly. Her eyes darted to meet his, a brief sneer flashing across her face, before they returned to the floor. "Yes, Godwolf, of course I have. But I am hardly the one who needs their strength," she said sternly. He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Let's just get on with it," he said. Caled grunted in surprise, but despite it, he moved up to the lever on the X. A shocked look slipped across Leah's face as she looked up at Wolf's, but after meeting his cold, dead gaze, she nodded and fetched a silver water decanter. She poured it into the clay pot and mixed it as he stood up from the writing desk, the thick iron chains jingling as he moved. He approached the metal X, aligning his arms and feet with its structure. Leah finished mixing the pot, and as she grabbed a large paintbrush, she nodded to the guard. "Sorry about this, Godwolf," Caled said, a tinge of remorse touching his voice. Wolf met the guard's eyes and nodded. "Trust me, I understand," he replied firmly. Caled pulled the lever. A hurried, horrendously loud clicking sound reverberated throughout the tent as the loose chain links were pulled into the X. Wolf let out an involuntary yelp as he was pulled with the links into the X with a sickening metallic crunch. Born a slave and christened with the name Wolf in the unforgiving fighting pits, his life had been one of hardship mixed with brutality. However, when his latent ender powers had finally manifested, he had been elevated to a status akin to that of a god among his people. Now, he wore chains of a different kind. He found them all to be the same. The chains of slavery, the chains on a fighter in the pit, the chains tattooed across the skin that marked him as an ender, the iron chains on his arms now. Leah grabbed the large clay pot and set it next to the bound wolf. Then she grabbed the chair he had been sitting in. She sat behind him, dipped the brush into the pot, and began to sweep it gently across his back, starting from his left shoulder. The dark ink she used covered his tattoos, sometimes tracing them, but mostly making large circular designs. She finished his back quickly despite her tender touch, and Caled released the lever. Wolf let out a deep breath as if he had been underwater. He turned himself over to face Leah in the chair. She nodded in approval, and the guard pulled the lever again. Once again, he is pulled into the X, and the breath is knocked out of him as he is lifted off the ground. Leah waited a moment, and then began the process again, careful not to look him in the face. He made an effort to stare straight ahead as he let his mind wander. The intricate tattoos that marked him as an ender spread across his body from his left shoulder when he used his power. The more power he used, the more it spread. He knew the legends. When the tattoo spread all the way across his body, that would be it. His life would be forfeit to those very same powers. Against the backdrop of sweeping sand dunes and makeshift tents, the camp was abuzz with a sense of urgency. The distant echoes of battle, the clash of steel against steel, the anguished cries of wounded warriors served as a constant reminder of what was at stake, and the harrowing conflict that raged out there, beyond this tent. Leah stood, her task done. Caled released the lever again, freeing Wolf. The other guard who walked in with Leah left, and Caled moved back to the tent's entrance. Wolf walked to the other side of the X, towards the entrance, and he put his arms out to his sides, posing in a cross. Leah grabbed a vest lined with tiny steel rings and slung it over him. guiding his hands through the armholes. He didn't seem to feel her touch. His eyes were forward, facing the guard Caled, glazed over. She strapped leg armor on him, and then she threw a pair of sandals in front of him. He stepped into them, still looking forward. Silently, she extends her hand towards him, wrist up. Capturing his attention, he mirrors the gesture. She pulled the chain on his wrist tight, then slapped a leather arm protector on him. Then she did the same for the other. He continued to stare straight ahead, his arms held forward, wrists up, as Leah pulled his long black hair back and began braiding it with leather and gold. When she was done, she pulled a full metal face mask from the iron chest. It was a plain thing, undecorated, with 2 leather bands that crisscrossed on the back. She put it on him with all the respect one does a king with his crown. After putting the mask on him, Leah stepped to his right side and turned to face the entrance with him, her hands clasped in front of her. Caled opened the tent's entrance and motioned to the guard outside. A moment later, a man walked in dressed in fine white and red robes made of silk. He wore a golden mask in much the same fashion as the one Wolf wore, but jewels lined that golden crest. His armor, too, was akin to Wolf's, with the added exception of gold and jewels. He's accompanied by the guard who previously left. The man with the golden mask nodded at Leah, then at Caled. They both bowed and left without a word spoken. He looked Wolf up and down, appraising him, as Wolf stood with his wrist out. "Can you do this?" he said to Wolf, looking him in the eyes. He didn't respond. "I suppose it doesn't really matter if you can," the man in the golden mask said dryly. He reached into his robes, producing a leather pouch from around his neck. He pulled a large golden key from it and pulled Wolf's wrists roughly towards him. He slapped the key into the iron rings and unlocked them. Then he got on his knees and unlocked Wolf's ankles. Still on his knees, he looked up at Wolf and said in a hushed reverence, "Do what you always do. Protect your people." Wolf met his gaze and finally let his arms drop to his sides. He gave a single nod in affirmation to the man in the gold mask. The man stood and turned, leaving the tent. A moment later, he shouted outside, "To victory!" As the lone guard held the tent flap open, Wolf emerged. A profound hush blanketed the camp, before it erupted into thunderous cheers. The guards who ringed the tent now moved forward, clearing a lane to the front line. A group of Dravia witches started running down the line of guards, screaming, singing, and dancing their way through the onlookers. Wolf didn't need the legends to tell him what he already knew was coming. He didn't mourn his short, tragic life. In a way, he had already lived multiple lives. He was worried for them, though. Despite the adulation he received, he remained a captive in many ways. Today, those chains would be wielded as a weapon. With a determined resolve, Wolf took his first step towards the battlefield. Leah's role in the camp was that of a servant, a position that had brought her into Wolf's life in a unique way. She cared for him, but it was a care born out of necessity rather than affection. Her interactions with Wolf were marked by an unspoken understanding, a bond formed in their shared crucible of an existence. In the beginning, when she had first been assigned to serve the ender known as Wolf, fear had been her constant companion. His reputation as a fierce warrior had preceded him, and the stories of his brutality in the fighting pit had sent shivers down her spine. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, she discovered a different side of the bestial man. He had saved her from the cruel lash of a whip when clumsiness had earned her the wrath of their masters. He had offered her food when her stomach had growled in hunger. She knew better than to mistake these acts of kindness for friendship. Her loyalty to Wolf was a pragmatic one, driven by the survival instincts that had served her well in the unforgiving desert. In this world, trust was a rare, precious commodity, and she had learned to rely on herself above all else. As she watched Wolf head to the battle, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding, Leah couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the chains. What secrets did he hold? What memories lurked within the depths of his tattooed skin? The brighter symbol that had adorned his left shoulder, when she was near it, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a testament to the mysteries that surrounded the Enders. The Dravian witches ahead of Wolf started chanting in harmony. Their dances began to synchronize, swaying in time to each other, in an undulating wave, while Wolf slowly trailed behind them. As they reached the front line, a crack like that of a nearby lightning strike tore from the witches' direction, and they lifted their hands towards the sky. The midday sun seemed to intensify at the direction of their outstretched palms, and unearthly spiritual trumpets blared. The Dravian soldiers, upon hearing the trumpets, parted, leaving an opening onto the field of death. The witches filled the gap immediately, and began sprinting towards their enemy. Wolf followed at a slow jog after them. The witches in the back of the group began to fall, exhausted, leaving only the 2 in the front remaining. When the 2 of them were about 10 feet away from the first almond, they held up their hands and let out an unnatural, guttural scream as a massive ball of greasy orange fire rolled away from their outstretched hands. After rolling another 10 feet, it dissipated in a screen of smoke. The two witches collapsed immediately. All of their energy, all of the group's energy spent on that one attack. Wolf didn't waste the opening as he followed the murder's ball into the almond front line. His leather arm protectors sizzled and popped until they exploded in a miniature fireball of their own. A fiery chain of supernaturally molten metal fell away from his exposed skin, seemingly running out of the tattoos on his forearms. He swung them in a large arc in front of himself. They whistled as they sailed through the air and popped like a whip crack as he stopped them. Almond soldiers were eviscerated. Limbs were lost, but there was no blood, just smoldering corpses. Blood-curdling screams echoed, and Almond held what was left of his arm, as the heavy metal armor still smoldered. No protective equipment, save for another Ender's weapon, could withstand the chains. The stakes of this war weighed heavily on the minds of the Dravians. If Almond were to emerge victorious, the outcome would be a grim one: enslavement and the brutal subjugation of their people. To the Dravians, Wolf's role as an Ender was the last beacon of hope in these dark times. As the sounds of battle intensified, the Dravians clung to the fragile hope that their champion could defy the odds. They revered Wolf as a deity of war, yet they remained cautious. They recognized the volatile nature of the Enders, whose power, while awe-inspiring, were equally destructive. Wolf slowly stalked forward towards the soldiers of Alma, like a starving animal licking its lips at the anticipation of a kill. The Almonds panicked, breaking rank, and they ran, trying to push through their comrades. The hungry wolf seized the opening like a throat. He ran at the back of one of the retreating soldiers and jumped. He swung the chains high above his head and brought them down forcefully in front of himself, arcing them to his sides before they grazed the ground. As his feet touched the sand, he snapped one of the chains to the front and the other behind himself. Then he swept them back to his sides. He didn't follow the path of the arcing chains with his eyes. Confident in his practiced motions of killing, he deafened himself to his enemies' cries. The tattoos on his arms began to turn the same supernatural color of the chains he wielded. It was known among the Dravians that an Ender's weapon and their tattoos were intricately linked to their past lives. The memories they unlocked were not just a source of power, but also a double-edged sword. Enders who pushed too far risked activating the dreaded Ender Curse, a cataclysmic explosion that could bring devastation to both friend and foe. With every battle, every surge of power, the danger grew, like a tempest gathering on the horizon. A monstrous bull-like creature gored its way through the retreating soldiers in front of Wolf. It turned its large one-horned, one-eyed face towards him. Its pink skin glistened with sweat. It opened its meaty lips and spewed a yellow noxious cloud out through its far too human-like teeth. It roared at him, and in response, he snapped his right hand out at the monster, sending the chain whipping through its eye and out the left side of its head. It screamed a high-pitched squeal in pain and charged. Wolf took a couple steps forward, then sidestepped to the left. He turned and cracked the chains in an X as the creature whizzed past him. It collapsed in a heap, headless, as he turned back towards the almond force. The poor beast had bought them enough time to regroup. They stood in their standard shield wall formation, spears outstretched, awaiting a careless strike. He paced back and forth along the wall, just out of reach of the spears, just out of reach of his chains. Those shields would not save them from him. Those spears, though, complicated his task. Adding to the difficulty, the almonds now appeared somewhat more confident than they had just moments earlier. As the sun cast long shadows over the field, Wolf stilled himself. He knew the risks, understood the consequences, and yet he pressed on. He was a symbol of defiance, a living embodiment of hope in the face of his countrymen's despair. As the sun reached its zenith, the almond force had closed around Wolf. In an attempt to catch up to him, the Dravian soldiers desperately tried to push forward into the breach he had created. Almond shields formed a wall around him, spear tips aimed at his arms and legs as he continued to pace. A palpable tension radiated from the men. Wolf broke it by taking a final, deep, contemplative breath. The metal barbs sprung toward him. He deftly danced between the spears, making his way towards the group of soldiers behind him, the group that separated him from his countrymen. He coiled the chains around his arms as he moved, smacking the spear shafts in between wrapping the links around his forearms, careful not to touch his face in the process. Only his arms were immune to the ender weapon, and he didn't want to ruin what little protection the steel mass offered. As he closed the distance between him and them, some of the almonds faltered again and panicked into the rushing Dravian forces. Others remembered their training, though. They dropped their shields and destroyed spears as they drew the short swords on their hips. They attempted to encircle him once more, trying to capitalize on the tight quarters he had willingly provided them. But he lashed out, striking their swords away with coiled chains like an animal cornered. Some of the strikes found purchase between the coils on his arms as he deflected the blows. The almond swords began to glow a hellish reddish orange. Blood and molten metal splattered the sands in the flurry, neither group wanting to relinquish an inch, for it meant death. Wolf's memories of this unforgiving land were etched into the very core of his being, intertwined with the memories of his past lives. As he stepped closer to death, he felt the weight of those memories pressing upon him, urging him onward. The chains that adorned his arms rattled softly, as if in anticipation of the battle still to come. The briar symbol on his shoulder flared to life. It pulsed with a quiet energy, a promise of the sweet power that it carried with it, as it melted through the concealing ink, then through his protective vest. The chains across his body lit up like the coals of a smith's furnace. The thick concealing ink billowed off of him in a black cloud like steam from water dropped on a red-hot stone. The vest fell off of him, completely slagged. His sandals melted into a pool. His shin armor warped in spots and his pants threatened to split. The only thing that remained unmarred was the mask. He didn't notice. One of the almonds, shocked at the sudden transformation, dropped his guard and Wolf pounced, striking the poor man straight in the face with his chain-wrapped right hand. He averted his eyes as he pulled his hand back as fast as he could. It came free easily with a sickening plop noise. He used the opportunity to try and shake the coiled chains loose on that arm as he relaxed his grip on the chain. The almonds took a second to decide if this fight was one they needed, as the scrambling Dravians closed on their flank. Wolf knew he didn't have a choice but to press them now, before he took a spear to the back. He lashed his right arm out, freeing the chain. It spun in a spiral in front of his outstretched palm. He swept it sideways, cutting down 2 of the 3 men to his right. The 3 to his left acted as if they would strike out, but he raised his left hand defensively, and they balked. The surviving man on his right didn't wait. He tipped under the chain and sprung forward like a snake, his short sword clenched tight in a thrust. Woof, his attention divided, dodged a blow a little too late. The sharpened metal skimmed across the exposed surface of his ribcage, leaving a profuse gash. Wolf growled and dropped his arm, hitting the man on the crown of his head with his elbow, making him stumble forward onto his knees. A sharp pain raced through his right arm as the sensation of knocking his elbow against a metal helm traced its way up. He shook his left hand free of the coils as he turned in place, lifting and spinning the chain on his right arm. One of the men, still standing off to his right now, let out a shrill cry, and he threw the short sword at Wolf, who blocked it deftly with his left arm. The man didn't wait to see if the sword made contact before he turned and ran towards the almond camp. Wolf ceased spinning the chain, allowing its momentum to ensnare the fleeing soldier. He screamed in pain as the chain seared everything it touched, melting through flesh and metal alike. The scream was silenced quickly as Wolf pulled the chain tight. The group of almonds that had been pressing his back watched as the man fell apart, unable to do anything for him. They stopped abruptly, queasy at the sight. Wolf understood the feeling. He was sick with the visceral horror of it all once before, a lifetime ago. He had seen the image play out 1,000 times through dozens of different eyes now. The 3 remaining almonds, now behind him, were swallowed by the pitched Dravian soldiers as they converged on Wolf. The cacophony of war echoed through the desert, a restless chaos that gripped him like a siren song. Each step he took brought him closer to the heart of the conflict. Amidst a sea of combatants, Wolf was a solitary figure, his chains and the briar symbol on his shoulder marking him with a radiant orange light. Lilandra, a young witch from the nomadic tribe of Isla Roar, watched the conflict unfold with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She watched from the back lines, recovering her strength, resting after her summons. Her keen eyes took in the intricate dance of combat, the interplay of strategy, and the chaos that defined this theater of war. She knew that the fate of nations hung in the balance, and the outcome of this day would reverberate through history like an echoing thunderclap. For Lilandra, this was not just a battle. It was a chance to test her abilities as a witch. Her lithe frame belied the immense power she possessed. The desert winds whispered secrets to her, and the very sand seemed to respond to her command. With a wave of her hand, she could call forth the elements, shaping them into deadly weapons or protective barriers. She was the strongest of her tribe, but she knew she wasn't the strongest witch of this wartime conclave. She was eager to test her skills against the ones in Alma who called themselves mages, a sacred title among Dravia. To them, it meant those who mastered the elements. As she observed Wolf, her eyes narrowed with a mix of curiosity and disgust. She had heard tales of his prowess, the legendary ender who had risen from the pits to become a living symbol. She also knew the risks that came with such power, the temptation to push too far, to unleash the full force of one's abilities. Right now, he looked like a dog who had slipped their leash. The battle raged, an unyielding tempest of violence and desperation. With each passing moment, the sand shifted, and the outcome remained uncertain. Wolf, his chains in motion, wove a lethal tapestry of strikes and counterattacks. His movements were at first a delicate balance between restraint and carelessness. Now, exhaustion setting in, his movements were slowed. He erratically pushed deeper into the enemy line. As the sun cast long looming shadows on the horizon, the ender lit up like a beacon, drawing the eyes of friend and foe. as he crashed once again into the almond line. Belander watched horrified. Is he insane? Does he want to die? She said in a disgruntled whisper as she pulled her long black hair back. She donned her mystic's veil, covering her face in a colorful purple shawl, the color of her tribe, Isla Roar. She took a couple deep breaths, hoping that her strength had returned. Then she stood,